Hey guys, first regardsman here, and so I'll be talking about the new factions that should come to Space Marine 3, and to talk about this with me, I have brought on Jefficus once again. Now Jeff, the new hire Steve Allison at Saber, he recently gave us like the kind of leaked information that Space Marine 3 is coming in 2028, so this is a perfect time to talk about which factions we want to see in the game. So which ones are you looking forward to?
Well, I think that Saber should definitely reuse the Tyranids and not the Thousand Suns, but definitely Chaos in some way. And we see this with things like From Software games, where from Dark Souls to Dark Souls 2 to Dark Souls 3, and even in Elden Ring, you have a lot of the same enemy types. The variety expands with each experience and with each new game, but they simply build on the foundation that the previous game set up for the next game. And I think that with Space Marine 3, we'll probably see something similar where, you're seeing enemies like the Chaos Spawn or the Zangor Enlightened or the new Terminus Sorcerer enemy that's coming out. And you just see the animations for these enemies get better and better and better as compared to the Chaos Space Marines that Space Marine 2 had on release, which appear more like robotic, right? Which is fitting because they are just space dust being animated and controlled by lesser sorcerers and stuff like that. But I could totally see, Chaos Space Marine 2.0 being released in Space Marine 3 alongside a third faction, which would be completely new, brand new to the Space Marine franchise. My bets are on Necrons, but man, I would love to see orcs again.
I think that they do kind of seem to toss Thousand Suns. I mean, that's a crazy take. Maybe they could reuse certain things like Spawna animations and stuff like that. But as far as the Chaos faction of Space Marine 2 is concerned, I think Thousand Suns are way undercooked. But they have added in a lot of new stuff for them, like that Chaos Terminator Sorcerer. And as far as the Tyranids are concerned, I think they need to stay and do all the way into Space Marine 3. I think Tyranids are done very well in the game.
They're
They're
perfect.
very popular. I think Tyranids also just fit as an enemy faction that players are expecting already. Because I think most players going into Space Marine 3, they're like, okay, we're going to see at least one of the factions from the original game, and Tyranids are the obvious pick there. So throwing them in, I think they would fit perfectly. All you really have to do is just expand the roster a little bit and upgrade some movesets, and I think players would just be like, this is awesome. This is more of what we wanted. And in the case of a third faction, I think that is the most important thing because, like you said, we have like another Chaos faction and then a third brand new faction. I think Necrons are just the obvious choice here. I think everybody's been asking for Necrons. We saw a Tomb World in Space Marine 2, and they would just like kind of fill out the roster pretty well, in my opinion.
Yeah, and Saber has learned a lot from the community feedback in Space Marine 2, and you can kind of break down what Necron enemies would appear at which levels. Like, for example, with the Tyranids, we have things like Spore Mines. Well, you could easily transfer some of those mechanics of having a miniature flying unit into something like a Scarab Swarm with the Necrons. And then you have things, you of course would have ranged units as well, but I don't think that they would go overboard with range units with the Tyranids, mostly because of how year one of Space Marine 2 was with Chaos Space Marines, where it was almost too much. There was too many ranged enemies on the screen at any given time. And so they would throw in a good mixture of, specifically when it comes to the Major's enemies, of ranged and melee units, try to balance it out to be more of a 50-50 or maybe even like a 60% melee units, 40% range units type variety. I don't know if Necrons even have ranged Minor's enemies like the Tyranids do, though. I'm trying to go through the catalog of everything in my head, and nothing is really coming up. They basically just have, like, Necron Warriors are kind of like the lowest tier unit that they have, and to me, that's more of a Majora's type enemy. So
Like
you
in
would
the
have to
case
have.
of Necrons, what you could do is just kind of swap how the faction works around. Like fundamentally, we don't have to follow the exact same structure as Space Marine 2 for Minora's enemies into the Majora's enemies and stuff like
True.
that. I think that they could very easily just expand upon that or make the faction entirely unique. And in the case of Necrons, the biggest complaint I see players talk about in like theorizing Necrons is like, oh, they're all ranged enemies. Oh, they are all like, self-reviving and stuff like this. That's gonna be so annoying to fight against. I'm like, it's only gonna be annoying to fight against if they do it improperly. Like ranged combat in Space Marine 2 is at the moment the most undercooked portion of the game's combat loop, in my opinion. I think a lot of players seriously just have like no feedback on range fire. I think in a lot of cases you're just stuck fighting the Tyranid Devourers, the Rubric Marines, and just shooting your ranged enemies or your ranged weapons back at them because that is your only option. And unlike the melee combat, where you have the option to parry, block, dodge, and like that just feels way more intuitive and just a lot more fun for the player. And if they add in more options for you to respond to enemy range fire, you really wouldn't have the issue of feedback that you do in the game currently, which is like where I think a lot of the problems are coming out for players in the first place.
I think when it comes to, I guess, self-reviving or Necron reanimation, I think this is where you could actually introduce more interesting extremist type enemies, where it's like you want to take care of an extremist first, you want to prioritize it because it is resurrecting enemies. Like, for example, with the Chaos Sorcerer that we have with 1,000 Suns, it already does that. We already have that mechanic in the game, and they could literally reuse that for Necrons if they really wanted to. Maybe they, put a new coat of paint on it and make it so that this extremist has to go up to the Necron corpse and reanimate it from up close, but the reanimation is much faster because of that. And so reanimation is not necessarily a mechanic that I would be too worried about. I think that when it comes to game design, Saber can incorporate the how they want to see a class or an enemy be portrayed in game, while also having the creative liberty to make sure that it doesn't piss players off. And we kind of see this with the Tech Marine, and this is kind of why I have so much faith in Saber getting this right, is the Tech Marine is portrayed very phenomenally. Like whenever I play as the Tech Marine, I feel like I'm playing as a freaking Tech Marine, and it's also one of the more fluid classes to play in the game. So I feel like they absolutely nailed it in what basically Space Marine game design looks like post Space Marine 2 game launch. So I think that a lot of the feedback that the community is giving Saber is going to be applied with this potential third faction.
And on the note of Minoris enemies for Necrons, there's always a chance that by the time Space Marine 3 actually comes out, there are new, as of yet, unrevealed models for the Necrons that will fit that roster. And I think that'd be a pretty cool thing to see, because we were talking about this before with the new class that's coming to the game, that they do kind of tie in tabletop stuff with the upcoming game launches. So like Tech Marine came out with AdMech, and like AdMech stuff was pushed a lot this year. And we also have a Chaplain trailer for 11th edition, which means we're probably gonna get a Chaplain next year. Either one of them, we're gonna have a kind of like a tie-in on the tabletop, and I think they do something similar for Necrons. And at the moment, Necrons and Tyranids are incredibly prominent in both the lore of 40k and just the models that Games Workshop is trying to push. And I think the Necrons are an obvious choice. As far as the Chaos factions go, though, Jeff, which one would you like to see?
For me, I would want to see Black Legion 100% because there's a lot of variety. You know, you could fight a Coronite, or Coronate Berserker. You could fight a Zinjian type sorcerer, and then you could fight every type of Chaos Demon. We've already seen with Space Marine 1 that you can fight things like Bloodletters that would be very easy to implement. And so having a game with both, Bloodletters and Zangors and Chaos Spawn and Plague Bearers, probably not Demonettes. I'm not sure if Saber would risk pushing it that far and kind of touching that Slaneshi territory. I think that it's probably wise if they don't do it because they don't want to mess with trying to change the game rating or anything, depending on how it's portrayed, of course. But I think that having more variety is always better. I think a close second would be something like basically World Eaters, because it's not something that we've seen portrayed in Warhammer 40k video games either ever or in a while. And you've already got a lot of Nurgle type stuff with a game like Darktide. Like, it's already there. It's not Death Guard per se, but it is like heavy Nurgle influence. And I think that a lot of games more easily lean on Nurgle because killing zombies in a video game is much easier to explain to these video game rating agencies than killing actual people, or in the case of Slanesh, like nearly naked women.
Oh, absolutely. It's like something that's really hard to like pass by a publishing company. Like, hey, or even if you're self-publishing, which Saber probably will be, it's hard to just like kind of push that for corporations to be like, let's just put in the Slaneshi faction, which is why you don't see it a ton in games outside of stuff like Rogue Trader or
Yeah.
like
Or
later
Vulcan
games
2.
in Total War Warhammer 3 and stuff like that. As far as what I would expect from a new faction in the Space Marine 3, I think they're going to want to use as many of the assets they have in Space Marine 2, and that includes the Chaos faction. So having Black Legion, that makes sense. Having like the option to reuse anything from Thousand Suns, I think they will want to do that. And you know, we might actually get Thousand Suns in like an improved way because they have added in a ton in Space Marine 2 to the Thousand Suns roster. We have stuff like the Chaos Terminator Sorcerer. I think he is super fun to fight. And if they just make some improvements on the Rubric Marines and stuff like that in their moveset, they would definitely feel a lot better as well. And you know, the Thousand Suns faction might feel significantly better to fight in Space Marine 3 if they do keep them around, as long as they improve that range gameplay loop, because I really think that is where the faction in general is falling apart, is that the feedback loop and response from the player, or the options for the player against range enemies, is just not quite where it should be. And if they fix that up, it will be in a far, far better position. I think players will be pretty receptive to the overall, you know, just gameplay of it.
You know, what's interesting, FTG, is that on tabletop right now in 11th edition, we haven't gotten their codexes yet, but the Thousand Sons and the Emperor's Children are kicking ass in tournaments right now. Like, they're doing extremely well. And with them being with the Thousand Sons being competitive army, and with them being the primary faction being present in Space Marine 2 for the Chaos Space Marines, I would not be surprised if they just did Thousand Sons again, simply because there's probably a massive Thousand Sons community at this point. I think that Space Marine 2 really bolstered the Ultramarine community and the Thousand Sons community and the Tyranid community, of course. I think the top Xenos factions are Tyranids and Necrons when it comes to minis, and like, I guess, like what people are bringing to tournaments. But I would not be surprised if they did Thousand Sons again. I would just like to see Black Legion, and we kind of get a glimpse at what Saber is working on, because they have actually created a whole lineup of just regular Space Marine executions, because there are likely Ultramarines going to be introduced to the Chaos Siege mode. And so if you have these more realistic and more fluid moving Space Marines running around, it would be really easy to take those assets and throw them on some other Chaos Space Marines. And so that's why I've got a lot of faith and hope that we'll see something like the Black Legion instead of Thousand Sons.
That would be a pretty cool thing for like swap over. And who knows, by the time we get to the end of Space Marine 2's life cycle, there might be like a very obvious enemy to add to the game. It's like, okay, this is going to be put into Space Marine 3. So I think that a lot of the issues players have with like the current factions and just the range enemy feedback loop is going to be fixed in Space Marine 3, or at least addressed partially. And even the enemies that we do have in game currently will probably feel a lot better to fight in that game, like Devourers and stuff like that. So that is pretty much all I want to talk about in this one, though. I really do think it's like Necrons. As far as Tau and some of the other races I've seen brought up, like Orcs would be pretty cool. I think that'd be super fun to fight, but I really do think the three factions are going to be a new Chaos faction, maybe Thousand Sons again. Tyranids are like guaranteed, and Necrons are incredibly likely, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I think the last thing that I would have to say about this is that I think that Saber can make any Xenos faction work for Space Marine 3, and they could even make Imperium factions work if there is a more fleshed out Chaos Space Marine game mode in that game, if they really wanted to. But I think what it's going to come down to at the end of the day is, what are the most popular armies? What are people actually following? And what is going to sell Space Marine 3? Because if there's an entire community of people out there who prefer like Necrons, then you will probably see Necrons in Space Marine 3 just because there are more fans or more people who are more willing or who are more they're going to lean towards buying the game just because there are Necrons in it. We see this phenomenon with games like Darktide where they released the Skitarii, which is basically providing the first ever experience where you could play as an Adeptus Mechanicus character in first person in a Warhammer 40k video game, and that sold Darktide to tons of fans who previously were just not really interested in the game. And so being able to see Necrons, in the flesh in Space Marine 3 could be the difference between if or whether or not a fan picks the game up or chooses to skip it and wait for Total Warhammer 40k, because they are most assuredly going to have Necrons in that game at some point.
Yeah, I would say Necrons are pretty much the prime suspect for a new Xenos faction, and I would not expect things like Dark Eldar or Eldari, to be honest, but I know some
No.
players might want to see those, but that is all I have to say in this one. Thank you for coming on and talking about this with me, Jeff, and if you guys want to subscribe to Jeffkiss's channel, you can find it in the description below. If you want to sub to me, you can find me here as usual. I also want to say a special thank you to my channel members. You guys have been super supportive recently, and that's really helped me pump out content like this and all of my guides. And as always, thank you for watching. Take it easy. Bye.
The Emperor protects.